Welcome to your review on biology and the brain, probably one of the biggest vocab units. So after this, I encourage you to go to Quizlet and just review. We did have a lot of mnemonic devices for this unit, so I'll try to refresh your brains on those. Haha, your brains on brains. But remember that 3A, or our whole third unit, had all to do with biology. I'm also going to throw in a little bit of review from biology, like your class on biology on this lecture, just to remind you of some things that might be tested on that you probably haven't seen since your freshman year. So this is our unit overview. We'll be reviewing how neurons communicate, right? How your brain communicates with your body, how your nervous system and your endocrine system interact with each other, the fast and the slow way of communicating within your brain. So remember, biopsychology is the looking at how your biology, how you're physically built, and particularly your brain, interact and make you behave in different ways. Now, time out on brain. Remember that cognition, right? Cog caps. Your cognition is how you think. So that's not your brain structures or how those are related, but your cognition is how you think. Your biological psychology is how your brain is built. Okay, so this is the DNA part, just like the brain parts, the neuron parts, things like that. So remember that the basic cell in your body that is in charge of, that's in your nervous system is your neuron. So a lot of our neuron, nerve, those all start with that root here, meaning having to do with the brain or the spinal cord. So a neuron, there's a couple different types of neurons. Sensory neurons are responsible for sensing information and sending it back. Excuse me. And our motor neurons are responsible for making our body move once we have sensed something. So remember, our sensory are afferent, and then our efferent is going out. And inner neurons are the place where they connect in between. So I've got some pictures of those. But inner neurons are the ones that go in between the sensory and the motor, right? You sense something, and then you react to it with your motor neurons, sorry. So the parts of a neuron you'll need to know, remember that my dendritic field, dendrites meaning tree, they're on the outside. Those are the ones that receive messages from the other neurons. So right, they're my dendritic trees. My axon then is the body that goes down in between where the neural communication occurs very quickly, and it's wrapped in a myelin sheath, and that makes it speed up, right? It's a fatty tissue that makes that speed up. Remember that MS. So people that have MS, which is a disorder of the nervous system where they start to shake too much, or when they lose neural communication and they have problems with moving, that's when the myelin sheath starts to break down. So there's our first our mnemonic device, MS. If you have multiple sclerosis, it's because of a problem with the myelin sheath. Remember that my terminal branches are the place where they ends, and I'll show you some pictures of those in a second. And the cell body here, this is where the nucleus is, this is where the DNA is. This is kind of your classic cell picture when you learn cells in biology. So here it is a little bit in depth with everything I just said. I receive information with my dendritic trees, right? My axon is the part that passes along the message. Terminal, remember terminal means end, terminated, right? That means like it's ended. So your terminal branches or your terminal buttons, these are the ones that form the junctions with the other cells and send off the message. And there's my myelin sheath that speeds up the reaction or the message. Remember, it's very, very quick depending on the part of your body, 200 to 200 miles per hour. All you need to know, it's very, very quick. It's measured in milliseconds. The time it takes you to snap your finger, right, to blink an eye, that's the time it takes for it to send a message and then to come back. So depending on the neuron and how fast they're myelinated, or how much they're myelinated, will change how fast that nerve actually communicates. Remember that the action potential is the whole process of the charge switching, the positive and the negatives going in and out that you won't be tested on. So much the numbers that are associated with it is that there's a change in polarity. It goes from a resting potential where it's slightly negative, it polarizes, so it goes plus, and then it comes back. And that's because the axon is selectively permeable. That means that ions can go in and out. Remember when we were outside and we did that dance where like people came through and they went in and out and it was sent along. Remember that it has to go stage by stage. It's sent along in sequence. The firing of a neuron requires, like I said, that goes from the resting, depolarizes, to the refractory period. And remember, there's excitatory and inhibitory types of action potentials, some that stop the firing and some that start it, and that it has to reach that threshold before it can actually fire. Remember we talked about the threshold is kind of like your toilet, where you can't just push it a little bit. It has to reach the point where once it starts to flush, the entire action potential will occur, and then it'll go back to our resting potential. And then remember, it's an all or nothing response, right? If it polarizes or depolarizes, it will go all the way through. And there's something else. It reaches the point where it can't go anymore. That's the firing rate. So at some point, you can't keep firing it if it's already, if it's completely depolarized. Remember, it has to get back to its resting before it can fire again. So here's the action potential if you want to read through it. Remember that it causes the positives that come in because it's slightly negative, it pushes them out, and then that happens in sequence like so. So remember that neurons do not touch. It is a electric impulse, right? So it's electric impulse. That means, oh, can you see the board behind me? Remember that they're not touching. That my synapse here does not touch the other cell that's behind it. Hopefully you can see that. If not, I'll just look like an idiot. But that gap between the two is my synapse, right? It's the place where there's a gap between. It's also called the gap or the cleft, and that is the place where the electrical signal becomes a chemical signal. And those chemical signals are in the terms of neurotransmitters. Remember, those neurotransmitters, I'll give you a chart in a second, are what are taken in by the next cell, and they send the message along. So reuptake is where it's taken back into the cell that sent it, and then uptake occurs at the next part. Look at this gap. It's really, really small, but it's small enough that there's no touching, right? It goes from an electrical impulse here to a chemical impulse here. Your communication with neurons, remember, electrical through the cell, chemical to the next one. Here is a list of the neurotransmitters that will be tested on that you need to know. So we had a lot of mnemonic devices for these: acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate. And then endorphins are things that block pain, right? So we'll go through those here in just a second. So my acetylcholine, remember, that's action and memory. Remember that Alzheimer's, memory, ACH, right? So any AA. So acetylcholine, Alzheimer's, memory, and action. Dopamine, remember dopamine, if I have too much, so if I have too much dope, I go crazy. We talked to like dope, kind of thinking about it as good drugs. So too much dope, you go schizophrenic. Too little dope, you go to the Parkinson's, right? So if I don't have enough dopamine, I've got Parkinson's. If I have too much, it's schizophrenia. Remember serotonin. So too little serotonin affects my mood, my hunger, makes us sad. Most depression medications are serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. Norepinephrine, this is my alertness and arousal. GABA, remember, is inhibitory. It's GABA, glutamate, GABA, right? It's inhibitory. It's like it will shut you down. And then glutamate is the one that will excite. And you remember, like glucose, maybe a sugar that would excite you. And then GABA is all in uppercase, and that's gonna it's going to stop things from happening, right? So GABA is inhibitory, glutamate's excitatory. Here's my agonist versus my antagonist. Remember, there are things that can alter the place where they meet. So here is, so look at how it's kind of like a puzzle piece, right? And so my agonist and my antagonist can alter the way that neurotransmitters interact. So here is a picture of these two. So a neurotransmitter molecule, this is how it's supposed to fit. This one right here, an agonist might excite it, might cause it to do the same reaction. They're the ones that they make it stronger. So an agonist is going to make it stronger or mimic it. An antagonist blocks the neurotransmitter from locking, and so it inhibits it. So I think you guys were talking about some ways to remember that with English. Your antagonist is the person that's like against. Your agonist is the person that's for. So my agonist is going to mimic. My antagonist is going to inhibit or stop it. Remember, these are not the neurotransmitters. They're things that mimic. Drugs of abuse might mimic certain types of neurotransmitters. They make you feel happy, even though you don't have dopamine. It makes you feel like there's dopamine if it's an agonist. Now let's actually go into the nervous system, so how it's built. This is going to be a very quick review, so make sure you get out your notes and look at all those things on Quizlet. So the nervous system, remember, is broken into two parts. I've got my central nervous system and my peripheral nervous system. My central is everything in my head and spinal cord, and that's it. The peripheral is everything else. We talked about periphery and vision being the outside, so peripheral is everything else that's outside my brain and spinal cord. With my peripheral, remember, if we don't look into my periphery, you could be an auto accident. So that's how we kind of remember that. So you have your autonomic things that happen and your somatic. Somatic means that you can control it voluntarily. Autonomic are things that you can't control. Autonomic are things like your internal organs, your breathing, your heart rate. Blinking kind of falls into both, but my automatic things in my peripheral and then my somatic. And then remember, within your autonomic, so if I get into an auto accident, you have your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. So your sympathetic is going to increase all your body rates that you cannot control, so it's going to increase your heart rate, make you more alert, it arouses you, right? Your pupils dilate, your respiratory rate increases. My parasympathetic calms me down, so my pupils go back to normal size, my breathing returns to normal. Remember that my paramedics calm me down. When you're sympathizing with someone, you're trying to like arouse, right? You're trying to feel what they feel. The nervous system are made up of nerves, and we talked about that are make up neurons, right? So a neuron is a cell. They bundle together to make nerves, and then those nerves pull together to make the nervous system. Here is my sympathetic and my parasympathetic. Again, remember, here's my arousing, accelerates heartbeat. My calming ones is going to slow down my heartbeat. Central nervous system, blah, blah, blah. Oh, a reflex. A reflex is something within the spinal cord. It's an automatic response. So you have reflexes like in your elbows and your knees. It's an uncontrollable response in the nervous system. A simple reflex is one that bypasses the spinal, or I'm sorry, does not go to the brain. So remember, we talked about that most things go to the brain and then come back. A simple reflex only involves the spinal cord. So simple reflex only involves the spinal cord. So it goes to your spinal cord, it goes to an interneuron that goes right back to your motor neurons, it moves it away. So sense, move. It's a very quick reaction that does not involve your brain. So that's our nervous system. Now let's go into my endocrine system. Remember, my endocrine system is the slow nervous system. The endocrine system works primarily off of hormones that is controlled by your pituitary gland, is your major part of your endocrine slow system. So remember, the pit master, the pituitary gland, is in charge of all the other glands. These rely on hormones to communicate. Hormones have to go into your blood, which is why it's a slow way of communication. But your adrenal glands that are responsible for your flight or flight, like that quick response, epinephrine, norepinephrine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, fight or flight, they're located right here. A large amount of those are released immediately when they need to be, and those actually travel very quickly. But the rest of them need to build up. And we'll talk about those ones in just a second. So here's my other glands. We'll talk about your brain in just a second, but my pituitary gland is right below my hypothalamus. Oh, I'll call. No, we don't know Jorge Santos. So hypothalamus is right over my pituitary gland, and it controls it. That's why hypothalamus we'll talk about in just a second. My thyroid glands are for growth. My adrenal glands are fight or flight. Remember, adrenaline, adrenal, that's how you can remember that. Burst of adrenaline, adrenal. And then my pancreas is for my insulin with sugar. And then my sex hormones, we're going to talk about testosterone and progesterone. And, oh gosh, what's the other one? I can't think of it right now. Oh gosh. So testosterone from the testes, and then my ovary secretes the female sex hormones. In just a minute, I'll go over it. So let's talk about our brain then really quick. So this is the slow part. How does our brain interact with that? So the brain, so here's my introduction. We're going to go over the older ones and then the ways, well, first of all, the way we look at our brain, right? All the PET scans. My older brain structure, my newer brain structure, and then how they're divided. Remember that one way that we have learned a lot about the brain is by lesioning. So lesioning is where you hurt the brain somehow, and then you look at what's affected. So here, what happens when I cut off my cortex? Like, oh, you can't think anymore. So a lot of what we know about the brain has occurred because of removing or lesioning parts of the brains, either on purpose by cutting it, on accident by something that happens, or when stroke patients have a part of the brain that dies off by lesions. Other ways we've seen things with the brain, so here's some more tools. EEG is reading the electricity that goes on your brain. So it's just looking at, remember we talked about every time a neuron fires, it's an electrical impulse. So we can look at how our brain is firing by reading the electricity that goes. This shows a lot of brain activity, but not in parts of the brain. if we actually want to see parts of the brain with images, we do one of these four. So our CT or a CAT scan, a PET scan, an MI or an FRMI. These are things that we're going to actually be able to see an image of the brain versus just the electrical impulses. So my older brain structures, actually let me go over those real quick. Sorry. CT on my CAT scan, that's just looking at like almost like an x-ray of it. It's going to give me the structures, but not necessarily damage. My PET scan, positron emission, this is when I have a glucose, radioactive glucose, and it's looking for energy that's released. Oh my gosh, I'm coughing, I'm sorry. My MRI creates a magnetic resonance imaging, gives me an image of the brain as well. My functional MRI is looking at parts of the brain that are active while I'm actually doing something. So if I asked you to solve a math problem, it'd be looking for the parts that I could see during an MRI. This is looking for blood flow. So I'm looking for the blood flow in parts with an MRI or an fMRI. fMRI means functional. It means I'm supposed to be doing something. Versus my PET, this is looking at the glucose or the amount of energy that's being consumed in that part of the brain. So let's start with my older brain structures. I'm going to put it in my hand so you guys can remember this. Remember my brainstem, the bottom is my medulla oblongata, my pons, then my reticular formation. This is called the reptilian brain. Remember, that's why we did the snake like this. My medulla oblongata is responsible for my heartbeat. We did medulla oblongata, reticular formation, reticular formation. So if this is my heartbeat, my vital functions, remember my reticular formation is alertness and awareness, and the pons is kind of the area between the two, and this is all going to go up into my first part of my brain, which is my thalamus. So my thalamus, remember, is my relay station. So all of my senses come up here, and then they go whew. So we talked about thalamus, right? And my thalamus is my senses, everything but smell. So sight, touch, hearing. What am I missing? Taste? Oh, all my senses except smell, they go through here, right? Whew, my thalamus. It's just a relay station. It says, where should I send this in that part of the brain? So my thalamus goes up into my cerebellum, which is right. So wait, here's my thalamus right here. My cerebellum, I'm sorry, is on either side of it. My cerebellum, remember, is responsible for balance. Remember, Bella ballerina, right? So my cerebellum is my Sarah. She's a beautiful ballerina and has to do with balance and coordination and the parts of your body that are in charge of memorizing that. Your limbic system, then, this is having to do with your hippocampus, my amygdala, and my pituitary gland. So let's keep going up. If this is my brainstem, it goes up to my thalamus and my hypothalamus. So my hypothalamus, remember, is my 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. So remember those. My hypothalamus is in charge of all of those things that are responsible for my pituitary gland, and that my hippocampus is the structure that goes over here that's in charge of memory, right? And so my hippocampus is everything to do with memorization. The things that you're learning right now and reviewing are in your hippocampus. Remember, smart hippos go to campus, to school. So memorizing, hippocampus. My amygdala, remember, Amy, the I'm so angry, I'm so scared, I'm so angry, I'm so scared. Remember, this is my Amy. She's very emotional. She has to do with aggression and fear, and then emotions, are emotional Amy. And then the hypothalamus we just talked about are my 4 F's, right? So those are the part with the reward center: feeding, mating, fighting and fleeing, those types of things, running away. They're responsible for my pituitary gland. Anytime I have disorders like depression or anxiety, there's something that's thought to be wrong in the limbic system and here. My cerebral cortex then is everything that's on top. So my cap on top, my cerebral top. Remember that this is the part that makes us higher order thinking. The cerebral cortex is the part that sits on top. It's anything outside right here. This is the limbic system in here. This is your cerebral cortex, and it's broken into a couple different parts. Remember that there's different lobes. The ones that glue them all together are called glial cells, but the lobes are broken into here. So if you turn your braid sideways, remember that your temporal lobe is right here. It's over your ears, kind of near your temple. That your frontal lobe is right here. Your parietal lobe is in back, and then your occipital lobe is in the way back. So remember your occipital lobe, parietal, frontal, and my temporal. I probably just messed up on my hair. And then your motor cortex kind of sits on, if this is my frontal, and this is my parietal. It sits on just the front there, right? And then the sensory cortex is right behind it. So my motor cortex, remember, mapped out. If you want to look at this, there's more sensory and motor dedicated to the places that I need more sensory and motor neurons. So let's go to sensory real quick. So sensory is right in front of motor. So motor, sensory. My sensory, like, remember, they're switched. So my left goes to my right goes to my left, right? We'll do the split brain here in a second, but remember that those two are opposite. Your function of the cortex, remember the input is your sensory, the output is your motor cortex. Association area, so there's other parts of the brain that you need to know. Remember, we learned a lot about this when Phineas Gage, who had that pole go through his head, is part of it missing. The lobes that you need to know, remember a lot for language. So remember, language is in your left. Language is in your left. And there's a couple parts in your left part of your brain that are in charge of language, hearing words, speaking words, and making sense of them. Remember broca, broca, broken speech. That's when you actually go to talk. What Wernicke means like don't know what's going on. So broca is when you actually have something wrong with speaking. Wernicke is when you have something wrong with understanding. Aphasia is when you have any problem with language. Your language part then is involved in all this very complicated part. You actually have to see it. So your visual cortex, it goes to your angular gyrus, which transforms the visual into an audio code even though you're not hearing anything. That goes to your Wernicke's area that interprets that auditory code. Remember understanding it. The Broca's controls your speech. The motor cortex is responsible for saying it. So there's a lot of things that are involved with language. Remember that the brain can repair itself at a very, very young age, and then after a certain part when it's all hardwired, it's impossible to repair. The plasticity is the ability to regrow when there's damage done at a young age. So you might have one part grow into another when your brain is developing. Neurogenesis, remember neuro meaning cells, genesis means to make. That's your ability to make new cells when things are gone. Again, this happens only at a young age, not very often at old ages. Last thing we'll go over then is split brain. Remember that when your corpus callosum, so if I have two hemispheres here that are connected by that neural pathway in between called the corpus callosum, that a split brain is when that is split for some reason, whether it's naturally or on purpose, and the two hemispheres can't communicate. Remember that though that there is a lot of overlap, especially in our visual field, that there are some things that are exclusively in the left visual field and in the right, and we talked a lot about just going like this, right? And so this way to this way, if I can see it in this field and I can't see it in that field. And we went through this, but I'll probably go through this Sunday before. Look at the dot, two words, goes to different parts of your brain, and then point to what you saw. So depending on what you saw in your left or your right visual field will depend on what you can say and what you can point to, because your sensory and your motor also go to opposite parts of the brain. Other right brain, left brain interactions, remember that some things like language, your sense of self, perceptual tasks, those are all in different parts of your, or localized in different parts, your language and your left, your perceptual task and your sense of self and your right. Some research that goes along with those. Your brain and consciousness then, we'll talk about this. Consciousness is just your awareness, right? So your brain being aware of what's going on. The process of dual processing and the two-track mind, I'm going to go back and forth between this real quick. But dual processing then is when you have two things, you're constantly taking things in and then bringing things out, right? If you're driving, you're constantly like bringing sensory information in and then putting it back out or acting on it. And that the two-track model has to do with perceptual task and action task. So two-track mind, meaning that those things are going on at the same time. Dual processing, two-track mind, very similar. In our next overview, I will go through behavioral genetics and evolutionary genetics and review on biology. Again, long unit with vocab, so why don't you go back through, go on to Quizlet, and practice the vocab for this unit.